So I'm going to bring on here Craig Mish for our next presentation. Craig, thanks so much for being here with us here at PitchCon.
No problem, Nick. What's going on? Good to see
How
you.
you doing? Yeah, we're day two of PitchCon. Not even halfway done, which is crazy. And we've had already so many incredible panels. But if you don't know Craig Mish is a national radio host on the Fantasy Sports Network, the host of the Swings and Mishes podcast, and the founder of swingsandmishes.com. Fantastic name, by the way. Craig's been covering the Marlins on and off since 1998, and you can find him on Twitter at Craig Mish. Craig, so you are giving a presentation today on the what it's like to be an MLB insider while also translating that to fantasy analysis. I'm going to let you have the floor now, but really thanks again for being a part of PitchCon.
No problem, Nick. Thanks for having me. And yeah, I think that this is a really great cause, and I hope that a lot of you are watching and seeing all the great work that Nick is doing. And make sure that you donate. Make sure that you do it often, because I think that that's the main reason why I'm doing this here. Obviously, I want to make sure that you guys take care of this great cause and great people at Pitcher List and the Rally Up site. Make sure you head on over there. And Nick's been talking about it over the last couple of days. That's why I'm here to make sure of that and hopefully enlighten you a little bit on kind of where I started, how I started, and what it's like to be involved as a reporter in the game, an insider in the game, and how that all started and how fantasy started as well. And if it gets a little boring, Nick will jump in and just say, "Hey, Craig, this is really boring, so let me jump in and do some Q&A." And I don't know that we'll go the full hour here, but I'll go as long as I can. I'll pretend it's like a TV show or a radio show or something of that sort. So, and normally this is not the chair that I use on my TV show. I have a little bit of a smaller chair that they're making me use because they say that the back doesn't really look good on TV, but it is just so comfortable. And so I'm gonna stay in my chair for the course of this. So I grew up loving baseball. I think like a lot of us have, and I think that this time in particular has been really difficult for me. My son, for the first time, who is 7 years old, is now found a very big awareness as to what's going on. I took him to spring training this year in Jupiter several times. He's a big baseball fan. He's a big Marlins fan, and this has been such a kick in the groin having all of this happen. Not just for me, because I think for me, I think there's going to be baseball, and I think in the next couple of weeks there'll be an announcement. I know what everybody's negative about it, but I think it's going to happen. But for I think that for fathers that have sons and fathers that have daughters and daughters that have fathers, for all of us, it's been a really difficult time because he's growing up sort of the same way that I did. And I first fell in love with the game when I moved to Florida. I grew up in New York. I was born in 1973 in Brooklyn. Lived in Brooklyn for, I want to say, the better part of, I think, 7 years, and I never really found any sort of allegiance to any team, which I think has really helped me in the fantasy world. Because even though I grew up as a fan of Reggie Jackson and those 70s teams and 80s teams of the Yankees, when I moved to Florida, we had nothing. We had no Major League Baseball team. So what did I have? I had baseball cards. I had once a week watching the Cubs on WGN. I had the Braves on TBS. Both those teams weren't good. And then once a week I had the Yankees playing on I think WPIX or something on TV. That's all we had here in Florida. We didn't have a baseball team. The Marlins didn't come in until 1993. So I spent a lot of my time in the spring when I was younger. We're talking about 10 years old, 11, all the way through, I would say probably, until I graduated high school, going to spring training and spending a lot of times there. And I'm going to talk more about the specific instances that I can give you guys as far as why spring training is so important in fantasy. I think it's probably the single most underrated part of all of fantasy baseball, and there's a lot of people who may not agree with that, but I'll try to illustrate some reasons why for that. So the history on me is essentially I graduated from the University of Florida in 1995. At that time, the Marlins had just started, so I was able to sort of come back and forth between Gainesville, Florida, and my parents were still living in Miami at the time. And I was able to get credentialed, get media credentialed every once in a while for like random games at that time. But it wasn't like I was a full-fledged member of the media. I was only 20 years old, 21 years old. Now it's a little bit different. At 19, 20, 21, you really can do that if a baseball team will let you in, which is another dynamic under a blog site or something, or even if you're working for a publication. I have seen a lot younger people involved in it. At the time that I was involved, it was a lot harder to look at somebody of a younger age and say, wow, that, like, because everyone's coming from a paper at that time. They're covering it every single day. And they're looking at me like, who's this kid that's going to come into my locker room or clubhouse in this case? So, so the first experience that I had was essentially around 1994, 1995. I think I was a full-fledged fantasy baseball guy at that point. I was playing all sports. I was playing fantasy basketball in the late 80s, in the 90s. I don't have a strong recollection of playing fantasy baseball at that time, but what I did was I played a lot of micro league baseball, which was a simulation game on the Commodore 64. And then I played the dice game with APBA, and I had keeper leagues in both of those. We used to mail in the Commodore 64, you would simulate the games, and then you would go to your printer, you'd print out the box scores, and then you'd mail them somewhere else in the country. That guy would get his box scores, and he would mail them back to you. I did this for about 4 or 5 years. The problem was is that you could get into the general manager's disk and mess with the stats, and then your team inevitably, it was like a cheat code. And then sometimes I'd get those box scores back, and I would get swept like every series. I'm like, what am I doing wrong here? I mean, why is it that Will Clark is not hitting any home runs when I have him and Kevin Mitchell and some of these great San Francisco Giants players that I'm losing every game? Well, because they were going in and changing the box scores, and so it was a dirty business that inevitably I got out of. So as I'm sort of getting into the more into the fantasy world, and I'm using stats projections from AOL, the internet is popping on. I'm doing home leagues. I'm doing a lot of mixed leagues. I don't think I'm really doing the only leagues at that time. What happens is I get a job in Sarasota, Florida, and I moved there in late 1995, 1996. And I had never been a Major League Baseball reporter at that time. The fortunate part about covering sports at the University of Florida is that we had a journalism school that you were a reporter covering the Gators at the time. So I essentially covered the Florida Gators basketball team. I was the beat reporter for our station, WRUF. I traveled to the Final Four. The Gators went to the Final Four in 1994. Covered the baseball team, of course, covered the football team, Steve Spurrier during that era as well. But I hadn't had a lot of experience. I hadn't had a lot of experience covering Major League Baseball. So the first experience that I had that merged Major League Baseball and fantasy baseball essentially started for me with the first time that I was ever credentialed for a full season. Because to me, there's a huge difference when you're a reporter of some kind and you call up a Major League Baseball team and you say, hey, I want to cover your team for a day. In all likelihood, as long as you're working for some sort of regular publication, even if it's fantasy, they should allow you in for the day. I've seen that happen before. So you'll get what's called a day pass. You'll get to cover the team for the day. You get your access, hypothetically, to the clubhouse before the game. You get access to the press box so you can eat all of the food. And then you get access to the post-game clubhouse where you can interview the players after. And for me in 1996, thinking back on this, I'm very young at this time. I'm only 22, 23 years old. And I've never been in a Major League Baseball clubhouse before. So TV. I'm working in a market called Sarasota, Florida, which is just south of Tampa, and the station in Pittsburgh, Pennsylvania, contacts me and says to the station, "Hey, are you the TV reporter for the station?" "Yes, I am." "Would you like to get paid to do our full spring training interviews with the Pittsburgh Pirates?" And I'm like, wow, like this is gonna be cool. I'm 23. I'm gonna get to cover this. I play fantasy. I know these guys. Some guys I don't know. Remember, there's only Baseball America at that time. Very few publications that can tell you about rookies. And so I get the call. I go to the TV news director at the time, and I said, listen, they want to pay me to go do some freelance work Am I allowed to go? They're like, yeah, as long as you don't use any of our equipment, sure. I call the station in Pittsburgh back. They're like, you're going to go meet all of the players of the Pittsburgh Pirates. Again, I'm 22, 23, green as you know what, and you're going to interview them all for our TV special, for our spring training special. And so I'm like, all right, it's cool. You got to get there at 7 a.m. This is when the clubhouse opens. Okay, cool. I'm like freaking out. I have no idea what to do. And I said, listen, are you guys going to send me the questions? Well, yeah, we're going to send them. I'm like, oh, okay, I feel a little bit better. Now it's a lot different after 25 years. I think one of the biggest strengths that I have is interviewing. But at the time, I really didn't know a lot about what I was doing. So fortunately for me, in 1996, and I have the media credential here as well from 1996, so you guys can see that. Nick, I think that this is the one that I have strictly from 1996. Those are the ones from after that. If you go back, I think there's one strictly from just 96. Did you get that one? There it is. Okay, so 1996, the signature that you see all the way on the bottom there is from Jim Tredinich, and it says he is the public relations director of the Pittsburgh Pirates. So, I call Jim Tredinich. Jim Tredinich says, "Yeah, okay, cool. Come on over here, and and you'll interview the Pirates." And so I show up at 7 a.m. and I have my list of players, and I start interviewing them all one by one. And we're talking about Tony Womack, and we're talking about Al Martin, Kevin Young. I mean, these are names that you'd have to know in the 90s to do it. And the one that really struck to me the most was Jason Kendall. These guys are all on my list to interview. And this man, Jim Tredinich, comes up to me and says, "Look, I can kind of tell that you've never done this before. You didn't sound like you really knew, a lot. But what I'm going to do is I'm going to walk you through this from the beginning to the end." And Jim Tredinich, if you take a look right now, is still working as the media relations director for the Pittsburgh Pirates. He was the one who was essentially responsible for all of this with me, with reporting, because at the time I could have ran into some other media relations director or somebody who would have told me, "Hey, you're on your own," or "Yeah, just go grab the guys," because that happens a lot. I mean, you go into clubhouses and locker rooms, and a lot of them will just be like, "Yeah, see if he wants to talk, see if you could get the guy." Um, a few years ago on Twitter, I acknowledged Jim Tredinich as the one who started this all for me. If it was not for him, I don't know that I would have had the same success covering baseball, because this man took me under his wing, showed me the ropes, showed me how to speak to players, told me how I was supposed to dress, taught me everything A through Z, and didn't need to do it. And he was a guy that was already working for the Pirates, and essentially I'm just some kid coming in, probably never gonna see the guy ever again, right? I'm just gonna show up, interview the guy, send the tape off to Pittsburgh. They're gonna air it. I'm not even on camera. It's just my questions. They're the ones that are answering. And not only did he take the time to show me how to do it, but to this day, he and I, 1996, 06, 16, 23 days later, or 24 years later, we are still good friends, and we still talk all the time. And I thank him all the time, because I was so nervous. I didn't know what to do. Um, in fantasy, I'm like, this guy, I've heard of this kid Jason Kendall before, and I interviewed Jason Kendall. Afterwards, there was some sort of dinner in Bradenton, Florida. I ended up going there. Ended up sitting with some of the players, having dinner with them, talking with them. Kendall was one of them. He probably doesn't even remember at the time. And what I was so fascinated by were some of these interviews that they allowed me to have some leeway with them. And I remember thinking Jason Kendall is going to be a great keeper in fantasy, a catcher. And so the stupidity of me not knowing how to do an interview, I asked Jason, I said, "Man, like, did you play fantasy in college?" And he's like, "Yeah, I never went to college." And I was like, whoa, he never went to college. How is that possible? And now these days, I understand clearly that a large percentage of the kids who were in the June draft don't even go to college. Clearly, they come out of high school, or and I just remember being so amazed that here was a kid that was going to be playing in the big leagues and ended up being an all-star and really having a really good career and he never went to college. And so that's how it all started for me. And I think that that's a really good baseline for those people who uh, you just grew up playing games like I did, being a fan like I was. And had it not been for that first opportunity where somebody working for a team decided to sort of make me their project, and here we are 24 years later, we're still friends, we still talk all the time. He will still help me get guests on my shows, radio, television, and all because he took the time, I took the time, year after year, thanking him, constantly keeping in touch, and making sure that he knew how important he was to the development of my career as a reporter. So that's probably the first part of understanding how I can translate reality into fantasy. And a big part of that is developing relationships in baseball. And I think that it's been a strange dynamic over the past I would say 10 plus years, because even after covering the Pirates, and I think that we have pictures of all the other spring trainings that spring training credentials that I've been to. I've basically been covering this for almost 25 years. It's changed significantly in the sense that you now have all of this information that you're getting from reporters that you can, sort of take or leave depending on how you feel, strongly about the person that's covering the team. So when I was doing this, and I am playing fantasy back in these days of going to the spring games and trying to figure out who's going to make the team and who's not, my secrets were mine. And and that is a huge change now, because there's so many people that are covering the game. When I would go to a game and speak to a manager or speak to a player in 1996, 97, 98, 99, 2000, I felt like I was getting a huge edge, not over the world, because I'm not playing in the NFBC. It didn't even exist at that time. I just felt like I was getting a huge edge over the guys who I'm playing in the league. And that was sort of unheard of at the time, where I could find out about a player and a manager would tell me, oh, yeah, this guy's going to be the third man in the rotation. Great. Well, at the time, there's nowhere for me to broadcast this. And so I would just essentially use that to my advantage and hope, and sometimes to disadvantage, and hopefully end up winning a fantasy league. So I lived in that part of Florida, the west coast of Florida, from 96 all the way through 1999. One of my memories of covering fantasy also at that time was a league where very late in a draft, I was told by someone that there was going to be a pitcher coming to the United States that you may want to take in your keeper league like a year or two ahead of time, and he's going to be a superstar. And this was, I believe, a scout for either the Padres or the Yankees, because I think this player actually was originally scouted by the Padres, and his name was Hideki Arabu. And I'll never forget getting that information. And I felt like that was the first piece of real inside information in Major League Baseball that I had ever received that I could actually use. I never thought to use it online in a blog or anywhere else. I just thought, wow, this is going to be a great piece of information to have for fantasy. So you guys know the history with Hideki Arabu. I remember going to watch it at a bar. There was no like watching all the baseball games at that time. Arabu was really good in his first start. I'm on top of the world. I'm thinking, my gosh, I'm going to win this league. I got the best pitcher in the league, Hideki Arabu. And then, of course, after that, after his first start, it didn't go so well after that. So it just goes to show you that not all the information that you get is always going to is always going to work out. So after moving to South Florida and then kind of taking over more of the Marlins beat, it became evident to me that building relationships throughout the game is really the only way that I could report on the game, not just from a Miami perspective, but nationally as well. And and really, how do you end up doing that? How do you end up accomplishing that? And I think that it kind of all again goes back to covering in the spring, getting to meet individual players, getting to meet agents, and also developing a level of trust. I think that you see some of the best reporters who are covering the game right now, and you know their names. I don't need to tell you: Ken Rosenthal, Jeff Passan, John Heyman, Bob Nightingale. Look, sometimes it's right and sometimes it's wrong, but these guys have relationships in the game that sometimes can span 20, 25 years. And I don't really put myself in their category. Maybe I'm a notch below at that point. But what I'm really proud of is being the only one that's been able to have that as well as my own fantasy baseball show. And perhaps it seems trivial or silly, but when I got a call in 2000 from SiriusXM, essentially saying, "Hey, look, we're starting a 24-hour fantasy channel, and we know that you have some experience in television and radio and fantasy. How would you like to cover baseball for us for our fantasy channel and also host a 2-hour show every single day where you would be the only host in the country that's doing a live fantasy baseball show every single day?" I mean, it didn't exist at that time. There were other shows that talked fantasy every once in a while on the weekends. Lenny Melnick had his own, radio show on AM radio, terrestrial radio on the weekends in Long Island, but nobody had ever had their own show. But the only caveat to me doing the show was they had asked me, "Do you know of any people who could host the show with you that would add credence to sort of what you are saying?" And so here I am, sort of being offered a job, but kind of only being offered a job on the contingency that I could find a player to do the show with me. And so thinking back here to 2010, which is when it was, or 2011, who in the world, what Major League Baseball player is going to donate 2 hours of their time to work and work with me? And by the way, know that we're going to be talking fantasy on the show. So that was not an easy dynamic to come up with. But the good news is that for many, many years, covering the Marlins in the late 90s and into the early 2000s, I befriended a Major League Baseball player by the name of Cliff Floyd. And he and I became really good friends for about 20 years. And Cliff ended up retiring in 2009. And I approached him and said, "Hey, look, on top of some of this baseball reporting that I do, how would you like to come do a radio show with me every single day from, I think it was at the time, 2 to 5 Eastern? And I'll teach you all about fantasy baseball. All you got to do is, bring your buddies on the show. Kind of, we'll fake it through the fantasy part of it, and and we'll just do a show every single day." And Cliff was like, "I don't know anything about fantasy. I mean, I'm terrible at fantasy football. I did his fantasy football drafts for years." He's like, "But I guess so. Like, I guess I'll figure it out as we go." Now, obviously, you see, 10 years later, Cliff is one of the main broadcasters for TSN covering the Blue Jays and on MLB Network. But that's really, after doing some terrestrial radio, we did pre and post game for the Marlins. That's kind of how it all started with him, was with me doing this fantasy baseball show. I think that me doing that show created a lot of credibility for myself amongst teams and players and individuals that saw me as somebody that was on Sirius XM. And truthfully, if you have Sirius XM back then attached to your name, pretty much probably means that there is some credence to that. Unfortunately, I was never able to really break in on the strict baseball side of their operation. I did host for years, but was never really given a full opportunity, I don't think, to show what I could do there. And that's probably, in the last 10 years, the only regret that I have with SiriusXM, which is why I'm no longer there and I now work for Sports Grid. Was never able really to, after 10 years, I thought, you get to a point in whatever you're doing where I think things get stale a little bit. I don't think that they thought so. They, you know, wanted me to continue in sort of a different role, but I kind of felt like after doing the shows with Cliff, doing the shows with Fred McGriff, and doing the shows, I mean, after 10 years of doing something, I think something needs to change. And I needed a change, and that's why I joined Sports Grid. Now my 1 year anniversary is coming up next year, which basically I'm doing the same show I was doing on Sirius XM now, except for there's no baseball. So what happens during this time that I'm hosting the show on Sirius? I'm going under a Sirius XM credential to spring training and asking players, executives, and coaches about their season, and then using those interviews, the only one in the country that's doing that, on a national radio show. I'm interviewing Aaron Judge. I'm interviewing Curtis Granderson. I mean, you name anyone in the game. And what I'm doing is I'm taking the fantasy spin and I'm getting that on the air on my channel. Out of every 10 interviews, you guys have heard these before. How many are really good? How many are really going to help you have any kind of success and get any kind of inside info as far as fantasy is concerned? 1 out of 10, maybe two, not a lot. But they like the idea of me having these big names on. People would tune in. And if you're getting one or two pieces of information that you didn't have before your draft in March, because let's be honest, that's the most critical time in fantasy, then I'm doing my job. Through the years, we got that. It moved on toward the end after Cliff Floyd left. I was able to host with Jim Bowden, a former Major League Baseball general manager, and our show's name changed to the GM and Co-Mish. You guys may remember that show. We did it for a couple of years, and Jim had access to all of the general managers in Major League Baseball. So in essence, Jim lent his credibility to me. Through Jim's credibility to me, my name got out there a lot more, gave me direct access to all of these general managers as well, which I still have to this day, and managers that I have and still have to this day, and coaches and players that I'm able to have relationships with both on and off the field. For those of you who follow me on Twitter, you could probably figure out a lot of who those players are because I've been reporting on them for the last 10 years. So without getting kind of like anecdotal as far as the specific instances that that because there's so many of them that really helped out in fantasy, I'll just give you a few that I think really gave me a little bit of a leg up. And my recommendation through all of this, if you haven't realized that, is of course you don't have direct access like I do, being a reporter and covering the game, but the people that are at spring training every year that are covering the teams are the ones that you need to lean on before your fantasy baseball draft. And that does not take away from any of the analysis and any of the work that Nick at Pitcher List does or anyone else. But there's a huge difference when you have an opportunity in baseball. You can have the skill set all you want, but you're only as good as the team believes you are. And if you don't have direct access to a general manager or a coach or a player, there's probably not going to be a lot of information to be given to you outside of just the data that you're presented. Excuse me one sec. So the point is that when you get to spring training in 2021, we didn't have one this year, follow on social media all the people who are there. You can take all of the data and all of the information from the people who you consider to be great fantasy analysts, but there are hidden gems to be had if you know how to ask the right questions. And a few instances of that I can tell you specifically. Sung Hwan Oh of the St. Louis Cardinals a few years ago, the final boss, ended up making a huge impact. For better or for worse, I'll tell you when I'm right or when I'm wrong. That was a big name. If you go back and you look at my Twitter feed from a few years ago, a name that nobody had on any draft list. Only reason why I was able to have that is having a direct relationship with the people at the St. Louis Cardinals and being able to ask those right questions. And put that out on my radio shows on Twitter. Hey, make sure you get this guy, draft this guy. He's going to be a big factor. Now, look, he came and he went like every other closer in baseball. You guys should know that by now. There's no elite closer in baseball. I mean, you could say that there is, but you'd be wrong. You could say Kirby Yates is the best in the game. He won't be pitching in 2 years. I mean, this is the closer. But at the time, Sung Hwan Oh was somebody that was sort of unheard of that I was on before everybody else was on, not because I loved the spin rate, just because I was told, hey man, this is going to be the guy for us. And then I did, and he ended up being the closer. Ozzie Albies a couple of years ago also was a player that internally in the Atlanta Braves organization, um, I was told go way above anybody's online expectations for Ozzie Albies, especially in terms of power. I wish, you can go back and hear my old radio shows, things like that. He was on every single one of my fantasy teams at that time. Listen, conversely, I was a big buyer of Aledmys Diaz of the Cardinals a couple of years ago, even after the one good year that he had, and I was completely wrong about that. So it doesn't always, by getting information, lead to championships. But I think it's an untapped resource that your average beat writer who covers teams is not going to give you for fantasy. Now, of course, I will. but I'm only one of 30 guys in a market in Miami. So you're getting the inside on the Marlins. I mean, you'll be more than covered in fantasy for the Marlins, but I am not in Houston. Well, that's a bad example because they're in Palm Beach, but I am not in Denver giving you the inside dope on what's going to happen with the Rockies all season because I'm not there. I'm not in Arizona every single day covering them. So we're missing a huge resource in our fantasy community. And the reporters who are covering the game are not going to give that to you because they're not being paid to do it. Maybe some of them play fantasy, but you have to be the one to initiate those conversations either online or through email and get direct access from the people who know. You can have the greatest spin rate in the world, but if the coaching staff does not think highly of you, that opportunity is simply not going to come. Sometimes it will, and sometimes that can help, but you also have to know what the teams think about you, and that's a huge part of getting a leg up, I think, in fantasy. Now, if I could translate all of that information to actually winning in some of these expert leagues, that would be great because I don't win, but I could definitely give you the player. I can't construct the team, but I could definitely tell you the players that I believe are going to be standouts based on this. A good example of this past year was, unfortunately, the season at this point is what it is. But Brandon Hyde, the manager of the Baltimore Orioles, which, after I put it out, it gets reported everywhere, of course, told me flat out that the closer, if it's not going to be Michael Givens, was going to be Hunter Harvey. Like, that's it. He's the guy. So I'm like, okay, thanks. This is on TV. Put it on Sports Grid. Makes all the publications, all the people who write about fantasy. But that's not the job of the beat reporters to do that. That's why I take so much pride in helping people in fantasy. And I don't care how the other insiders or other people who cover the game think about me. I'm thinking about everybody else. I know everybody needs a leg up in fantasy. The only way they're going to get it is if I'm asking the right questions. So going back to these fantasy interviews, yeah, you're going to get 5 or 6 out of the 10. It may be the biggest players and names in the game, but they may not give you a whole lot. And that's kind of how athlete interviews are in general. But if 2 out of 10, I've just given you a gem in fantasy that you should be taking in a late round, I think you got to take that advice. And hopefully in the future, there'll be more people like me trying to do what I do. A couple of years ago at the winter meetings, when they had their executive meeting, they one of the questions that was asked by somebody that they still won't tell me who, but remember, this is all the executives sitting at the winter meetings having a meeting. Somebody raises their hand and says, "What do we do about Craig Mish at the winter meetings?" And then it wasn't the commissioner. I think it was somebody in baseball. What do you mean? What do we do? Well, he covers this from a fantasy perspective. So is that okay? Like, and MLB was like, yeah, absolutely, yeah. I mean, they should be embracing fantasy. They should be embracing gambling, but they should be embracing fantasy and bringing more people to play. There should be a fantasy person at MLB.com who covers a team that is the fantasy reporter for that team. Every single team. Why should I be the only one doing this from a Marlins perspective? Where's the person in Tampa, Atlanta, the teams in New York, the teams in Texas, California? So every day you could go on to MLB.com, you could read a column about the team, which is we're doing anyway. I mean, we're taking everything that these guys say at face value as it pertains to fantasy, and it doesn't, by the way. Where's that guy? Where's that person that at the very end of their column and it says the fantasy spin or here's what happened that'll help you in fantasy today? It doesn't exist. And that's a great way that baseball can grow the game because you have so many people that are watching this, that are paying attention, that are huge fantasy fans, but they're not getting that and they're not getting that information. So that would be something else that I would, certainly recommend. Finally, here's an example of a piece of information that I was given that I had a hard time figuring out what to do in fantasy, and I'll be transparent with this one. So in 2017, and for those of you who follow me on Twitter at Craig Mish, you know that I'm breaking stories in baseball all the time. Trades, players up, players down. It's part of what I do. It's part of my job. But one thing that happened really put me in a difficult situation. I had to go back and look at the date on this. I think it was May 25th, 2017. And I get a call from a friend of mine who is an agent in Major League Baseball. And he says to me, listen, we're going to have a pretty good story coming up tomorrow. One of our best guys is getting called up to the big leagues. Now, honestly, you think that this guy's a household name now? No one knew his name in 2017. And his name was Dinelson Lamet. And I had never heard of Dinelson Lamet. I am just being dead honest with you. In 2017, I didn't have a clue who this guy was. And I said, well, is he good? Like, oh yeah, he is going to be good. And I'm getting a call on a Sunday, and he's telling me, hey, not only is he going to be good, he's going to make his major league debut on Thursday for the Padres. And I'm the only one in the country that knows this. So I thought to myself, all right, well, normally what I do in a breaking news situation is I'll go on my phone, I'll pop on Twitter, and I'll say, source, Padres are going to call up Dinelson Lamet. You guys can Google this, by the way. You can see that I had it at the time. I'm not telling you anything that you can't find on the internet. Padres are going to call up Dinelson Lamet. He's going to make his major league debut next week. That's normally what I would do. But there was a Sunday, and I'm playing in an NL only league. So I thought to myself, maybe I'm going to wait a little bit on this one, because I think it was in May. It was late May, and here's a pitcher in an NL only league getting called up to the majors. If I put this out right now, everyone else in my league is going to bid on this guy on the fab auction on Sunday night, and I'm not going to get him. So what good is this information in fantasy to me if I break this right now? So I waited. And I think it was until I knew that all the bids had to be in. And I told my friend at the time, hey, look, man, I'm just going to wait on this one a little bit. What do you mean? I'm like, you just got to trust me on this one. I got to wait a little bit. I called a couple of friends that I knew. And I remember saying to them, hey, you're not in my league, so I'm going to give you a little bit of a tip. If you're putting in a budget, put in $1 on this guy, Dinelson Lamet. Why? He's supposed to be good. A lot of strikeout potential. He's coming up. Good ballpark for the Padres. How do you know he's coming? I'm just telling you. I know. No one's even sniffing this guy. He hasn't made a lot of starts in the minors. Padres want him up. He's going to pitch in the big leagues. Lo and behold, the Padres don't make any announcement because, they got to send somebody down. So that's what happens in baseball. Padres players would look at Craig Mish's tweet and go, oh, bleep, Dinelson Lamet is coming up to the big leagues. That means someone on the 25-man roster is getting sent down. That's a terrible sign. I try not to cut guys online. I try not to do that. But I had the promotion Sunday night, I even waited until Monday morning. I don't even know. Put it out. Dinelson Lamet, sources say, going to make his major league debut on Thursday. My NL only Tout Wars team, proud owner for no dollars, no fab budget of Dinelson Lamet. And I don't know. I mean, did I cross some sort of line there waiting? Did I take advantage of that in fantasy? And I could tell you that this has happened since then a few times too. This is the one that really I remember more than ever, because the people in the league were like, Dinelson Lamet, like, why, who, how? Like, and then the guy got called up the next few days. Now, again, I didn't win that league. I got an advantage of the league by getting a player, but in the end, I think that kind of tells you that conflict that I have, from fantasy to reality, which is like the crux of this presentation, about how sometimes it can conflict with some of the things that I do. So that's that story. Primarily now, I am when there is baseball, I'm covering the Marlins more or less home games. I'm not traveling on the road almost at all. I hope there is a season, and I certainly hope that everybody's able to stay safe, and hopefully they appreciated some of the things that I had to say. But Nick, I'm more than happy to take some questions, but that kind of summarizes my fantasy versus reality. I don't know if I missed out on anything, if there's something that I need to add.
That was awesome. Oh man. I had some personal questions there. You kind of answered some of them. I do want to mention really quickly, I believe it's 2017. is actually when I first met you, Craig. I don't know if you even remember this. I went to
At the
Tout Wars.
stadium, right?
Yeah,
At
at the Staten
yeah,
Island Yankees.
I
That's right.
remember. Yes.
Well, I remember being. You got to understand from me. I mean, I'm new in this, and I'm just like
Right.
I'm just so happy to meet everybody. I actually had to. I was putting out something that I needed to work on as it was going on, so I went to like a little room, and I think you were there on a couch.
I was like sleeping or something, right?
Yeah, well, you're doing that, but you're also talking to like the runner of Tout Wars. I don't remember who it was,
Yeah.
but you were talking about what you can do like this, and I cannot agree more about it. It's really stuck with me about like Tout Wars should be this massive event where like, people that are fans of it would go. I mean, I wasn't in Tout Wars. I mean, this is the first year I'm still
Right.
very lucky to be in it, and I was just so excited that I could just go to it. And I mean, you were talking about, yeah, we should have this as an event where people can come by and hang out and meet us and do this whole thing. It should be like someone announcing it on the fly. It should be this whole presentation. And you were talking about, I think even the year before in Tout Wars, you were like underneath a fish store or something like that. They had to go to like the back of or something like that in Chinatown. I don't remember exactly. I wasn't there. I just remember you talking about that.
Yes, that's correct. We had it in a restaurant in New York. It was like 2 hours delayed. There was no Wi-Fi. Look, the deal with for if you're in fantasy and you don't know what Tout Wars is, then this conversation may not really lend a lot
Mhm.
to you. But look, Tout Wars has been going on a long time. Of course, that I feel honored that I was asked to do it a few years ago, and I still have done it, and I have a lot of respect for the people that do it. But we're entering an age where I think that leagues like that need to be proactive as opposed to reactive, and we're at the point with that league in general where I personally think a lot of changes would need to be made. I agree 100%.
I want to make sure this is taken the right way, by the way. And no way am I suggesting that you were
I
doing
mean,
anything to Tout Wars. It was more of like,
whatever you say. I'll say it for I have for my opinion.
Mhm.
There's no possible way that I should be flying from Florida to New York in March for a fantasy draft, unless it's like some $10,000 stakes draft like the NFBC. Like that, I get. I mean, Tout Wars was meant to be held at a stadium with fans in Florida, in Arizona, like Labor was for many years, and this year was
Mhm.
in Florida. It was meant for that. I mean, have the event where the people are, where the people who are playing fantasy are. And I still enjoy doing it. I enjoy being in it. I can tell you that I, like you, was really wowed my first time that I was asked to be in it,
Mhm.
but it doesn't have the same flair for me because I think that as fantasy analysts and in this fantasy community, like things that we're doing right here, and like baseball, it needs to evolve and things need to change. You need to gear to what people are thinking and liking. And there's some younger people who are now involved in it. I'm not one of the younger people. I'm one of the older people, but I can sense that is an event that could be a lot bigger and a lot better, but a lot of it is old school type thinking,
Well,
unfortunately.
it was the takeaway for me, and the reason I wanted to bring that up was because from that moment, and first of all, I just loved the fact that I was just a fly on the wall there, and I was like, how did I felt like an insider for a moment that I could even be in that room listening to this. But the takeaway was I really like this guy Craig because of his vision of like how he wants to make this so much better and has this idea of like how can we make something that is already great and incredible, how can we make that just so much more. And that always stuck with me because I obviously I'm someone that's just like, okay, I'm going to dream as much as I can and stuff. But I love that idea of like, yes, this is something that's really special and fantastic. And how can we make this, as great as it can be? So hopefully,
It's not easy to do the things that I'm suggesting,
oh yeah,
and we get very comfortable in life just kind of having the same expectations of things, but it's kind of along the same reasoning where like I had a really good gig at SiriusXM for almost 10 years. It kind of abruptly came to an end because they wanted to shift around some things. But I mean, I could have easily still been doing my same show there.
hmm
But and you'll see Nick yourself too. Like after doing Pitcher List for 10 years, you're like you created this after 2 years. So it's like, what's next? Like, what is, if you don't try and make yourself better, if you don't try and think in the future, you're going to be left in the past. And that is not a motivational speech. I am not a motivational speaker, but I know
Right.
that there are so many great things out there that just sitting at home and just doing the same things that we're always been doing, it's not going to change, which is why I chose to take a new gig at Sports Grid.
Cool. So by the way, everybody in the chat right now, go ahead, leave your questions for Craig. We have some time to take some of those. Two things really quickly. One, I actually looked up 2017 Dinelson Lamet numbers for the NL only league. For those wondering, hey, how much of an advantage was that? Well, it was a 124 WHIP and a 29% strikeout rate across 114 innings, 4.57 ERA. Which maybe wasn't as like the unbelievable thing, but that's NL only, and that could work.
Free player, Nick.
Oh, okay. Yeah, that's a good point.
A free player.
The 29% strikeout rate, that's huge.
Willie Peralta goes for $200 in FAB, and Dinelson Lamet goes for $0. Why? Because somebody in the league knew Dinelson Lamet was getting called up. That's the point.
You know what's crazy? I think this is actually the second day in a row Willie Peralta has come up, which is, I don't know why.
Like, you head into these leagues on Sunday night, and
right.
Would you believe that Tout Wars changed the FAB one year to like noon on a Sunday? Like, so you could make all your moves, and then your guys get hurt Sunday, and then you can pick nobody up. It was the dumbest.
That makes no sense. Why would you do that?
They did that one year. I was dumb.
Well, at least they knew not to do it again.
They changed it back the following year. So
that's good.
But yeah, so it's like, think about that on your teams in the NL and the AL. There's no one to pick up. Like,
right.
And if anything major happens, if a player gets picked up, even if the guy is not good, and you know he's getting playing time, that's a $100 to $200 pickup in FAB,
sure.
1,000 in those leagues. And so if you can find, if you could play that every week, and you could say, I know this guy's going to start next week. Will he be good? I don't know, but he's free. Okay, fine. It's a huge advantage.
So then my question then is, how did you not win that league in 2017?
Because I'm a horrible constructor of teams. I don't know. I mean, last year I had Acuna and DeGrom. Like, I mean, how do you not win? And Real Muto. How do you not win that league? I haven't figured out the secret sauce. Now, I've been in Tout Wars now, or in that one, in Tout Wars in particular. Now, I did win one league last year. Nice. But I'm very transparent with how bad I am. So in Tout Wars, my first year, I finished second to last. The second year, I finished third to last. And then the third year, I finished sixth. So
there you go.
I feel like that was last year. So I feel like I'm making progress, but I still haven't figured out what it is that I'm missing to keep my team going all season long. Maybe I'm not good at the pickups. Maybe my drafts aren't really that good. I don't know. But I mean, I've been doing this for 25 years. I definitely should be better at it. But look, the other part of it too is I'm going against people who have won these leagues, and they have a lot of more experience than I do. In the NL Snake, I have a home league that I've been doing for almost 25 years. I've won that a lot, and I've made a lot of money doing that. But they're not like experts, It's just like my buddies. So giving me money, donating.
So one of the things I wanted to hear a little bit more on is you talked about with the Lamet situation that how you got your information was someone gave you a phone call.
Yep.
What is that normally like? Is it normally just someone just randomly gives you a phone call that you do know? Is it typically like kind of a scout? Is it some sort of GM that wants information to be leaked? How does that come about normally?
I mean, it could be a combination of all those things. A lot of the times, it is rare, but not unprecedented. It is rare, but not unprecedented that I would get a call to say, "Hey, you may want to know this." I would say out of 10 pieces of news that I break, maybe 2 are like that. The rest of them are me poking the bear. Like me making the call, asking questions, staying on top of it, following up the next day. And a lot of the times it's not scouts. A lot of the times it's a player, an executive, or just somebody on a staff of some kind. But I will tell you that none of that, Nick, happens on the first call or the second call ever.
Right.
In person.
Right.
It is developing relationships. I can't tell you how many times that, and a lot of it is in the spring. I mean, some of it, of course, is during the season with texting and all that, but people are just so willing to talk to you, Nick, in spring training. I can't stress this enough. They're like, they haven't talked to anybody in 6 months. Yeah, what do you think players would be like? Oh yeah, talk to me, talk to me. You'll sign autographs. I'll do whatever you want. I haven't done it for 6 months. They get tired of it, and then you lose out on a lot of that information. But I can't tell you how many times I would tell my wife, "Hey, look, I got to go to the spring training game. There's somebody that's going to be there that I need to see, I need to speak to. And Nick, this is driving 45 minutes or an hour there, 45 minutes an hour back, accomplishing nothing financially for me that I could ever
Right.
use. But I'm
Right.
able to sit at that game for 10 minutes and speak and see that person face to face, that maybe in 6 months, maybe not, but maybe
Right.
in 6 months, that person's going to tell me that this guy is going to sign a 5-year, $100 million contract, and I'm the first one to have it.
Right.
Maybe.
Right.
And that's worth it for me. I really enjoy that.
That's great. You also mentioned that it's not just asking questions; it's asking the right kind of questions. Is there a certain piece of advice that you give people to kind of figure out what is the right question?
I think that's the biggest strength that I have in interviewing, and I think that listening to Howard Stern on radio for many years, who I think is the best interviewer that there's ever been, has always led me to that point. I think when people come on my show, I think I get more out of them than most other people do. And what I don't think that, and I can't speak for all reporters, and this is no knock on anybody who covers baseball, because I don't have the relationships with everyone, and I don't know how the dynamic works. But listening to answers, Nick, is something you would think that it's really easy, but reporters go into press conferences and they go into interviews with a pad and a pen or their iPhone notes, and they ask questions, and they ask all the questions that are on there. Nick, I have a list of questions. If I've asked them all, I failed. I have failed at my
Hmm.
job, because that means that I did not get something outside of these 10 things that I wanted to know. I got just generic answers. What I do is I try, if someone's willing to talk to you about something and they're willing to open up, you need to take that next step. You need to go to that next level and expand upon that question, because you may get an answer that you didn't think that you would have. And
Sure.
so a good, and I can come up with a million examples like that of times that I've interviewed managers or general managers or coaches. And again, it does come down to relationships and how comfortable they feel around you. But on camera, or on the radio or in an interview, if you are simply looking and firing off your questions, you're going to miss something that you're going to be able to take advantage of. And that's the one piece of advice that I would say, is that you have to be a better listener than you are a questioner.
Nice. That's a great answer. So we have a question here from Sandlot Sports. They ask, is it ever tough to break information or ask questions that might hurt a relationship you have with a player?
Yeah, I would say so. Yeah, I mean, you definitely, you find yourself sometimes, playing favorites at time. I definitely can see that. I've never let that affect me as far as saying something negative about a player, an executive, or a coach. But I would say that, just, maybe the big, reporter, the big insiders. Again, I don't consider myself one of those. I'm just in the group. If a player or an executive is nice to you, you're more likely to be nice to them. And so the impartiality of it may be lost a little bit in that discussion. And that's something that, unfortunately, I can't sit here and tell you, oh, this guy's nice, and this guy's nice, and this guy's nice, and that guy's nice, and this guy's not, and so I ripped them. I wouldn't do that. I wouldn't go that far. But if somebody is willing to engage me and help me, obviously I'm going to be willing to help them. And by the way, any reporter that tells you that they don't, they're really not being 100% true.
Nice. GemC1013 asks, what is your favorite Jose Fernandez story?
My favorite Jose Fernandez story is one that I was not there for. I had heard a story that in 2000, was it 17? 15, 2015, Jose Fernandez was in the Marlins clubhouse, and he was and he was just in there. The Marlins, what they had done is they had fired their manager at the time. I believe it was Mike Redmond, and Redmond was replaced by their general manager, Nick Dan Jennings. I don't know if you
Yeah,
remember.
that was ridiculous.
It was. Dan's a great guy, by the way, good friend of
Yeah.
mine. But at the time, it was ridiculous. It shouldn't have happened, and even the president of the team, David Sampson, who was pretty good at admitting fault, I think in the past, admitted that was a bad decision. So the story that I had heard, and got confirmed to me, but in many different ways, you're not really 100% sure, is that the players find out in the clubhouse that Redmond got fired, and the manager is going to be the general manager. So Jose Fernandez is, Jose Fernandez wants an extension. Make no mistake about it. This guy played with a lot of joy. He was, fantastic for fans to be around. But look, he had a side of him that, like a pitcher, he had a little bit of a needling side. So he was going around the clubhouse going, "Oh my God, oh, you're never going to believe this. Oh my," like he couldn't believe that they're going to replace, Redmond with Jennings. So Martin Prado, who is brand new to the team, is like, what's going on? And they're talking in Spanish, so there could be some lost in translation here. So Prado in Spanish says to Jose Fernandez, "What's going on?" Jose Fernandez says, "Do you believe who they hired to be the manager?" And Martin Prado in Spanish goes, "No, who they hired?" And remember, Mike Hill is their general manager. I don't know if you know who Mike Hill is, but he's their general manager of the team. And Jose goes, "They hired Dan Jennings to be the manager." And Martin Prado, this is what I heard, said back to Jose Fernandez, "The black guy?" Which was Mike Hill, the general manager of the team. And everybody erupts in laughter because Martin Prado had no idea that Dan Jennings, who was the general manager, Mike Hill was the president. One guy was white, one guy was African American, and Martin Prado mixed that up, and apparently it caused a huge roar in the locker room. So that's my favorite. I know not the story that you were expecting.
That's amazing, though.
Is one that I have told many times because it's simply so hard to believe that a player on and Martin Prado is probably one of the nicest in history of Major League Baseball, but that he could be confused not knowing who was going to end up being the manager of his team, which summarizes the 2015 Miami Marlins.
Oh, that's awesome. I think we have time for one more question. That was a great one. Yancey Eden asks, how do you address people that think you are a mouthpiece for an ownership?
I think that then they don't know me that well, because I think that my track record is covering things fairly, honestly. I suppose that every once in a while somebody will say that I'm pro Marlins, or I believe everything the Marlins are doing is right, but they haven't gone back and checked my track record of reporting on the team. I think I cover it very fairly. I am a reporter for the team, and that covers the team, and I think like every reporter that covers a team in their market, you have a little bit of a slippery slope, and you have to be careful to not piss off the mouths that feed you essentially there, because I am covering that club. But I think I am fair. I've put bad news out when it's bad, and I've put good news out when it's good. And so I think that maybe those kind of people, as Yancey would ask, maybe because I'm the top reporter at what I do covering the team, and maybe I put out the most information on that, I would not misconstrue that with me being a mouthpiece. I just would construe it as I'm somebody that breaks the most stories and knows the most about what goes on with the Major League Baseball franchise. But I don't think that I'm constantly on the pro side, but I appreciate the question.
Well, we certainly think so. Well, Craig, thank you so much for this. This was a fantastic look into what you do, and obviously a unique perspective that we really don't have ourselves. So thank you so much for taking the time for this. It was really great to have you as a part of PitchCon.
Oh, thank you so much. I'm honored to be invited, and make sure everybody goes over to Rally Up and make sure they donate to the cause.